First, I want to talk a little bit about my own background and how I came to be where I am today. My family grew up in a village in Anatolia, in a small village in Yozgat, and they both moved to Istanbul when they were about 10 years old with their elder brothers or sisters. They're both primary school graduates. They didn't complete school in, I think my mother didn't even manage to complete primary school. She doesn't have primary school. She has 4 years of primary schooling. My father the same. But through some kind of luck, they went to the UK, the United Kingdom, as workers, as gurbetçis at the time. And, you know, as with many gurbetçis, their plan was to scrape up some money together and then come back to Turkey. That didn't happen because they had children and their children went to school and etc., etc., so they ended up staying there. I'm the first person in not only my family, my small nuclear family, but my whole extended relatives and family to go to university. Not the first woman, the first person. And that to me has been a very, it's been an education, because it's shown me and many of the people around me what the power of education can be. And after me, there were many of my cousins and, you know, my younger brother, all continued on to higher education. And this showed me how my life opportunities and my life chances were actually altered as a result of having the opportunity of education. If we had remained in Turkey, maybe I would have or wouldn't have, I don't know. It's difficult to say. But because by chance my family went to the UK as workers, I went to university. And I was always interested in development issues, even at university. In fact, before I went to university, I took a year out. And my first idea was to study psychology, but then I had a small health problem, so I took a year out before I went to university. And during that year, I spent a lot of time in different volunteering projects. I worked in the geriatrics clinic of a hospital. I worked in a charity shop, the Oxfam charity shops. I worked with Down syndrome children, and it was just to try and understand and learn and pass the time as well, because, you know, I wasn't going to school, and all my friends were in school or working. But that gave me a sense of what I wanted to do. It gave me a sense of that I wanted to be involved in development. I wanted to be involved in social change. But I wasn't quite clear about it. Then what happened is that I had received high A-level results in the UK. And one of our lecturers, one of my teachers at college said, "Why don't you apply to Oxford University because you have such high grades?" And I was like, oh my God, Oxford University, it's like unbelievable. But he said, you can't apply to Oxford for a psychology degree. You need to, why don't you apply for, they have this program called Politics, Philosophy and Economics. And I said, okay, but the thing was, you couldn't just apply to Oxford for politics, economics and psychology and philosophy and apply to all the other universities in psychology, because they would say to you, well, you know, do you know what you want to do? So that year, I applied to all, just thinking that I may get into Oxford University, I applied to all the universities to study economics and politics. And that's how I came to actually study economics and politics. I didn't get into Oxford University. I failed the interview because, and you know, these are small what ifs. How I think my life has had certain changes along the road. My life would have been very different, I think, if I'd gone to Oxford University. I may have stayed there, I may have got a good job in the UK, but I didn't get in because one of the questions they asked me at the interview, I had these 3 Oxford professors, and I come from, you know, I grew up in a very poor, deprived part of the UK. If anyone knows the UK, they will notice from my accent that I still have a very East London accent, okay? No matter how many years of college, how many years of working, you can't get rid of the accent. But anyway, they asked me a question about Ataturk. They said, what are the 5 principles of Ataturk? And I didn't know. I didn't, because I'd never studied. I came to Turkey every year. I went to the beach. I sunbathed. But nobody had ever told me about the 5 principles of Ataturk. And that's why I failed to get into Oxford University. So I thought, oh, OK, I need to learn more about this. This is obviously going to be important in my life. So I need to learn more about my country. So in subsequent years, when I came back, I did try to learn more. And then when I graduated, I moved to Turkey and wanted to work here. With an economics and politics degree, and given that 18 years ago, there wasn't really any such thing as NGOs, 18 years ago in Turkey. If you said that you wanted to work for an NGO, people would look at you and say, well, are you going to become a terrorist, or are you going to become some kind of other activist? Applied to Finansbank at the time, economics degree, you work for a bank. And the Human Resources Director called me in, and he said, we actually have a new position. It's for a foundation that has just been set up by the wife of our chairman. And I said, what is it about? He said, I'm not quite sure. It's about mothers and children and education, but I'm sure it's interesting. And I said, OK. He said, why don't you meet Ayşe Hanım? So I went to meet Ayşe. At the time, my Turkish wasn't very good. And I went to meet Ayşe Hanım. And so Ayşe, and she said, so what do you do? Why did you come to Turkey? And we'd revised the line. It was, Turkey is a very dynamic country. So wherever I went, whichever interview I went to, it was, Turkey is a very dynamic country. But if you asked me anything beyond that, I couldn't tell you. That's all I had memorized. And Ayşe said to me, so Ayla, it's about mothers and children and education. And I said, but what am I going to do? And she said, well, we're going to teach mothers and children, and we're going to provide an education. And then at one point, she turned around to me and said, and I didn't understand what the job was. I didn't understand what the organization was. At one point, she turned around to me and said, so, would you like to join us? Are you going to join me on this journey? But she said it with such feeling that it was impossible to say no. If somebody was to turn around to you and say, will you join me on this journey? How can you say no? You can't. So I said, yes, Ayşe, and I will. And I went home that night, and I said to my girlfriends that I was living with, I said, I think I've just taken a new job. And they said, oh, really, what are you going to do? I said, I don't know. They said, how much money are you going to get? I said, I don't know, I didn't ask. They said, where's your office going to be? I said, I really don't know. But anyway, what if I hadn't acted upon that instinct to look into Ayşe'n's eyes and say, yes, I will join you on this journey? I think my life would certainly have been would be very, very different. And I think in some way, AÇEV's life would also be very different. So I'm grateful to Ayşe Hanım for providing me with this opportunity. So that's how I got to be where I am. I went back and forth for a time. I went back to the UK to do a master's, and then I came back, and then I went to the US. But for me now, the question, and we spent a lot of time in developing. I'm not going to talk about AÇEV because we have a website. You can ask me questions afterwards about the details. But I was blessed to be given an opportunity to not just work with AÇEV, but to work on a broad range of issues. And I also began working for the Özyeğin Foundation. And then in 2005, I just had my baby. He was 2 months old, and I was thinking, maybe I'll take a break, go part-time for a little while, because we all work very hard, and if you have a 2-month-old baby that you need to breastfeed, you should spend some time at home rather than go back to work. And then Hüsnü Bey called me in one day. Hüsnü Özyeğin is my other boss, if you like. And he said, Ayla, I'm going to set up a university and I'd like you to lead this project. And he said, will you do it? And again, it was like, how can you say no, especially to Hüsnü M? You can't say no. If Hüsnü M asks you to do something, you don't say no. And I said, yes, I will. And I went home, and I was married at the time, so I said to my husband, I said, I think I've just got a new job. And he said, what are you going to do? I said, I think I'm going to set up a university. He said, what? How do you set up a university? Where do you begin? But, we began, we had a great team, and now we have Özyeğin University, which I remain a trustee of, but we have a fantastic team that is doing a great job in realizing its potential of becoming a very entrepreneurial university in Turkey. But again, what if I had said no to Hüsnü M and said, no, I'm sorry, I have a 2-month-old baby and I want to stay at home and take care of him? Again, my life would have been different. The university would probably not have been it, but my life and the enriching experience it gave me would have been different. Now, today, my focus is not on what would happen to me, but what if the world is a different place for a number of reasons. I'm just going to spend the last 2 minutes talking about something that I'm really engaged about for the past year and a half. And it's really this, that although as NGOs, we do a great amount of work and we reach a number of people, what really needs to be done is systemic change. And for systemic change, you need to have policies change. You need to have resources directed at the right places. And this is a much, much, much more difficult task than saying, okay, I'm going to go out and train 20 women here and 50 men there. Because systemic change, it means that you have to battle against all these different vested interests and ingrained ways of looking at things can often be very, very challenging. In 2005, one of the other things that we began to do is we said, at the time as AÇEV, we had reached 300,000 people. But we said there are 7 million children between the ages of 0 to 6 in Turkey. Even if we had another 100 AÇEVs, we still wouldn't be able to reach all of the children. So AÇEV by itself, or another 5 AÇEV, is not the answer. The answer is to have systemic change that will be sustainable and that will impact everyone in society, or at least all the children in society. So that's when we began the 7 is Too Late campaign, 7 çok geç kampanyası. Today, as a result of that campaign, and as a result of all the partners that we engaged into that project, preschool education that was 20% at the time is now 70%. In 5 years, it's 70%. And the government is committed to making it 100% by next year. If that is not impact, then what is? But this we did not do by ourselves. I certainly didn't do it by myself. We didn't do it by ourselves. We had to build alliances all across the sectors, across the civil society, across the private sector, across the public sector. But that was a success. Now, the thing that is on my mind these days is something else. 85% of women work. I think that most of you here are working women, if not your students, and that you will hopefully go on to work. But 25% of working women, in Turkey work. The government's projection, or target, sorry, is that by 2023, there will be 35% of women in the workforce. Now, this is incredibly low. There is no way that Turkey can become the 10th largest economy in the world if only 35% of its women are in the workforce. This is unacceptable. So we have to look at ways that we can increase women in the workforce. Half of them don't have any type of job security, social security, health security. So something has to be done about this. About a year and a half ago, we started working with Kagider, saying that we need to do something about this, and what stands in the way, what is the most important thing that stands in the way of women working? It's childcare. Everyone knows this. It's a no-brainer. It's childcare. If women don't have support for childcare, they cannot go back to work because it's not financially feasible for them to send their children to either a kindergarten or a thingy or have a private nanny, because the amount that they earn, it just doesn't make it financially feasible. The average gross salary of women in Turkey, according to last year, is 1,100. That's gross, okay? So it's incredibly low. How can you expect a woman that is earning net 800 TL to send, when she has a child, to send her child to a kindergarten that is on average 500 lira and go to work? So something has to be done about this. And what needs to be done about it is that you need to have a state subsidy for this. This is what we have found across all European countries, across all Western economies. If you want to increase women's employment in the workforce, you need to provide childcare subsidies. So what we did is we worked with Kagidar, and we developed a financial model. This was actually developed not by us, but by PricewaterhouseCoopers. And here, what we tried to show, and it's a very, very extensive model. I'm just showing you the absolute overview. What we try to show is that if the state provides 300 TL to the woman, 300 in the form of a cash subsidy, then the woman will obviously go to work. And when she goes to work, all of the tax and benefits that will accrue to the state, to the public pocket, will be 458. Similarly, the child will go to a kindergarten, and there, because the majority of those that will be employed are women, they will also accrue public tax benefits and tax to the Treasury. So it becomes a win-win situation. Now, what do we need to do as concerned individuals? I'm not talking about the NGOs, because this is our responsibility, as it were, but as concerned individuals, everyone's made a call to action, which I love. I think it's great. My call to action is, if you are working, if you have a young child, or if you have women in your workforce in your workplace that have a young child, please do something about asking for childcare. Because if we don't increase the examples of this, the models of this, then nobody is going to take us seriously. We're going to be doing our bit to increase pressure on the government to implement this model. And one of the successes has been that we have managed to get this into the government program. The Prime Minister himself, as he read out the government program, said we are going to implement in this new term of our government cash subsidies to increase women's employment in Turkey. But when they will do it, we don't know. So we all have a responsibility to do this, because all of us women among here, we're probably among the top 3 to 5% of Turkish women. I guarantee you, we're among the 3 to 5 top percent. So for us, it may or may not necessarily be such a concern, because thankfully we're educated and we earn enough that we do have that option of sending our child to kindergarten or affording that childcare. But there are many, many women in Turkey, and it's because of this that these women, when they don't work, when they don't have their economic independence, that's when they suffer from inequality, that's when they suffer from domestic violence, and that's when their children suffer the most. So I want to thank you for listening to me.